Okay, as people start to come in, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to another Red Line Twitter Space panel. This one focusing on the recent political situation happening in Pakistan. Joining us today is Michael Kugleman, who is the South Asia Senior Associate at the Wilson Center, as well as the writer at Foreign Policy and their weekly South Asia Brief, and good friend of the show, Sahar Khan, who's the managing editor of Inkstick Media and a research fellow at CATO, both of which experts on Pakistan, India, and Southeast Asia. So I'm going to throw to Michael first. Why is this conversation coming up now? Can you take us through the recent political chaos and why Imran Khan was overthrown and is no longer prime minister?
Right. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to have Sahar here as well. So some days back, the Prime Minister Imran Khan lost or should I say, did not survive a no confidence vote, which the opposition had brought to the Parliament to oust him. The opposition got the votes that it needed, and he was removed. It's a long and complicated story, but to make a long story short, I think you have to go back to November when Imran Khan got into a bit of a spat with the Pakistan army chief, who is widely viewed to be, generally speaking, the most powerful political player in the country. The dispute was over who would become the next director of Pakistan's spy agency, the ISI. And once that spat happened, the relationship between the two men suffered in a big way. And what ended up happening is that the person who had been the head of the spy agency, Faiz Hamid, he left to go somewhere else. And Faiz Hamid had been a close ally of Imran Khan. So as a result, Imran Khan lost a key ally with the spy chief going elsewhere, and he also upset the army chief. And the opposition at that point saw an opportunity to pounce, and it then put together its no confidence motion. It used the justification of economic misgovernance, and indeed, Pakistan had been experiencing a worsening economic crisis back then that would get worse in the weeks that followed, which included pretty significant levels of inflation. And so then Imran Khan tried to fight back when the no confidence vote was supposed to come to the floor of the National Assembly in recent weeks. He blocked it. He essentially argued that it was illegitimate because it was part of a U.S. effort to oust him. The Supreme Court ruled against that, though. So eventually, the no confidence vote did come to the National Assembly. The vote took place. He was removed, and that then set in process the motion to bring the new government to power.
So, Zahar, I think for people who don't follow Pakistan as closely as yourself and Michael do, how much influence does the Pakistani military have on politics inside Pakistan?
Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's such a pleasure also to hear from Michael as well. The Pakistani military is an interesting stakeholder in Pakistani politics. Unlike usually when you think of a military, ideally you think of it as under civilian control, and a sort of adhering to the parliament and sort of taking that into account. The Pakistani military, over the past few decades has evolved into a political player of its own. So the military is not simply the military that protects Pakistan's borders, but it's also a business player and an economic player within Pakistan's economy. So there's a great book written by Aisha Sadiqa called Military Inc. that kind of goes over how the military has evolved. But very briefly, essentially, the military is not just a professional, armed forces and services, but they have welfare trusts and hospitals. They own pharmaceutical companies and vocational centers. They make cereal and cheese. So the Pakistani military is sort of in every sector of Pakistan's economy. Now, what currently is happening, Imran Khan, when he was elected in 2018, he did get some flack for having, a really comfortable relationship with the military. And to be honest, I mean, if you want to be in Pakistani politics and sort of have any position of power, you need to have a good relationship with the military to do that. But what's happened now kind of shows that there's a bit of a fallout between the military and Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which is Imran Khan's party. I think there's been a fundamental disagreement on foreign policy issues. And that's mainly because the army has generally taken the first step or has been ahead on foreign policy issues, and the civilian government really hasn't taken charge. And this is something that Imran Khan has wanted to change, but that's not an easy thing to change. So I do think that that this current sort of political chaos that Pakistan is going through is more domestically driven. As Michael mentioned, it's economically driven too, and sort of a civil military imbalance and all the tensions that go with it have driven it as well. But Imran Khan's accusations against the United States, I think, are a little unfounded. And I think he's using anti-Americanism to rally his base.
So, Michael, can you elaborate on a bit on that? You know, after Imran Khan was moved, he did accuse the opposition of using a U.S. conspiracy to get him out of power. You know, is there any credibility to that, or frankly, this is just a way to rally some of his supporters on an anti-U.S. rhetoric?
Yeah, I think it's the answer is closer to the latter than the former. I don't think there's any indication that there was a U.S. effort to oust him. What he was basing his allegation on was something that really did happen, and that was a private conversation that took place, I believe, in early March, between the Pakistani ambassador to the U.S. at the time, who has since left his post and gone on to Europe, as well as a senior U.S. official. And it was a private conversation at which the U.S. official vented about the state of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. He complained about Imran Khan. He said that he thinks the U.S.-Pakistan relationship would be better if Imran Khan were to not survive the no-confidence vote. And that's basically what happened. And so the Pakistani ambassador put together a cable capturing the conversation, and it was sent to Islamabad. And that is basically the evidence that Khan claims shows that there is a conspiracy to oust him. Now, obviously, it's one thing for a senior official to be having a private conversation with a foreign ambassador and, you know, speaking very frankly and privately about the relationship. Obviously, it's something else completely for the U.S. government to actually be working hand in hand with the Pakistani opposition on this no confidence vote to overthrow Khan, and the latter is what Khan suggests happened. So yes, I think as Sahar suggests, you know, Khan was essentially channeling the very deep-seated mistrust of U.S. policies and intentions in Pakistan, which extends quite a few years back. We can go into it if you like, and he essentially was exploiting that sentiment, which certainly is found within much of his support base, but also in some cases beyond his support base as well. And so, you know, I think that it didn't take much for Imran Khan to say, well, given what's happened in the past, given the record of U.S. meddling in the past, you know, this private conversation must mean that there was something greater at foot. And in fact, I'm certain of that. He didn't say that explicitly, but that was the implications of his narrative that he brought out about this conspiracy. So, you know, of course, U.S. officials have repeatedly denied that anything happened. What's also quite notable is that in recent days, some key entities in Pakistan, including the military spokesman, have indicated there's no indication that there was a conspiracy involving the U.S. trying to oust Khan. The Foreign Office in Pakistan has said that as well. So basically, no one other than Imran Khan and his closest aides and supporters, as well as his support base, have actually made this allegation. No one in the U.S. and more importantly in Pakistan within the government has indicated that there's something to it. But this is something that you can get away with in Pakistan, where again, you know, there's a tendency to assume the worst about U.S. intentions and policies there in Pakistan.
So if you just joined us, this is a live Twitter Space chat, and joining us today is Michael Kugleman, the South Asia Senior Associate at the Wilson Center and the writer of Foreign Policy's weekly South Asia Brief, as well as Sahar Khan, the Research Fellow at CATO Foreign Policy, and an expert on Pakistan and India. And Sahar, I'm going to throw this question to you. Why was the American relationship with Khan so, you know, fractured is probably the best way I can put it. Was it because he was mismanaging the economy? Was it because he was pivoting away from the United States? What fractured the relationship between Washington and Islamabad?
So the US-Pakistan relationship, unfortunately, has been on a downward spiral for some time, and this is something that Imran Khan inherited when he became prime minister in 2018. So the current state of U.S.-Pakistan relations, I say, are not necessarily Imran Khan's fault, but you have to go back a little bit in history to sort of understand why things went downhill. Now, from the U.S. perspective, the United States, when they were involved in Afghanistan, they kind of looked towards Pakistan as a partner and as somebody who could potentially bring the Taliban to the negotiating table, mainly because Pakistan had a good relationship with the Taliban. And when the Taliban had been in power in Afghanistan before 9/11, it was Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates who were the only three countries that had recognized the Taliban. So Pakistan, it's fair to say, I think, had a somewhat good relationship with the Taliban and enough of a relationship where they could potentially convince them to go to the negotiating table, which is exactly what happened in 2009 when, under the Obama administration, um, the political office of the Taliban was created in Doha. And one of the main reasons for this was to sort of open the door, right, for direct talks with the Taliban and US government and also with the Afghan government at the time. Now, fast forward a few years, the United States has always accused Pakistan of playing a double game where it says one thing and it seems that Pakistan is aligned with US interests, but at the same time, they're aiding and abetting not only the Taliban, but the Haqqani network, which is sort of its own entity, but also, linked with the Taliban. And so this is sort of in the United States stance. From Pakistan's point of view, Pakistan feels, and I think Pakistan is justified in this, but Pakistan feels that the United States only looks at Pakistan from either a Afghanistan angle or from a China angle. The US never really looks at Pakistan as sort of its own entity, as a partner that could offer it some kind of benefit or have some mutually beneficial relationship. Um, and now, with the US having withdrawn from Afghanistan, the relationship has gone even further down, where basically, President Biden, when he came into office, he did not even call Prime Minister Imran Khan, which I think was a first. Generally, no matter how bad relations have been, the heads of states always call each other. There has been interaction, of course, between national security advisors and sort of those parallel relationships, but President Biden has not called Imran Khan, which was kind of a first. And I think it also the fact that when Taliban did take over Afghanistan, a lot of Pakistani officials were sort of almost celebrating, and they were almost saying, I told you so, and kind of celebrating with the Taliban. And I think this was something that did not go over well with the United States either, because in US circles, it kind of solidified their point of view that the Pakistan was never really a US ally and was sort of really, working more towards Taliban's interests. So the whole thing is, I think it's covered with misconceptions and misperceptions as well of the relationship. I think Pakistan has so many domestic problems of its own. The economy is in really bad shape, which is something that I think has played a bigger role than Imran Khan would have liked to admit in his current, political turmoil. But as far as the U.S.-Pakistan relation goes, the United States is kind of hasn't really interacted with Pakistan that much, and which is something that Pakistan feels is unjustified, especially because of their cooperation in Afghanistan, especially after 9/11. So because of that, there's just a lot of you know, I would say distaste between the two. And then also Imran Khan's base in general, he has always used anti-Americanism to rally his base, and his base is mainly the youth of Pakistan. And I don't want to take up all the time, but just very briefly, like Pakistan is has a youth bulge, which basically means that at least I think 64 or 65% of the population is between the ages of 18 and 39. And unfortunately, they're the ones who are really suffering. If you're Pakistani today, it's very difficult to travel. It's very difficult to get any kind of visa. It's really difficult to get any kind of international business loans. And so this is something that his base really really wants. And a lot of and anti-Americanism has helped him. Even before he ran in 2018, he would point out all the hypocrisies within the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. And so he's just kind of taken that and run with it. But I think it's really dangerous because, these allegations are not going to do anything positive for the US-Pakistan relationship.
So if you do have questions for our panel, you can always DM the red line. I've got my DMs open here. So if you have questions for our panel, you can send those through, and we'll put them to our lovely panelists here. But I'm going to throw this one to Michael. Sharif's coalition is now in power, but it's a pretty shaky coalition. It's made by a bunch of very widely different political ideologies all working together on this one. Is it actually going to last and be stable, and will it actually win when the next election comes up which is not far away, in July?
Yeah, it certainly is a very interesting government, and in fact, the cabinet was just announced in recent days, and many Imran Khan supporters pointed out that a significant majority of the new cabinet ministers in this government are either facing corruption charges or have recently been released on bail from jail. So I think that this just sort of intensifies what has already been a hyper partisan and hyper polarized political environment in Pakistan. Which was always the case, but especially since Khan was ousted and he came out with these allegations against the United States. You've got a lot of folks in this cabinet that have served in senior levels in previous Pakistani governments, particularly between the years of 2008 and 2018, when what had been the two major opposition parties had been controlling the government. It is indeed not a government that has a long-term that has many long-term prospects at all. As you noted, the next Pakistani national elections are scheduled to take place in about a year. But quite frankly, there's a good chance that the elections could happen earlier than that. And there are several key dates to look ahead to. November of this year is when the term of the current army chief ends. And there's been some noises emanating from Islamabad and elsewhere that suggest that the current army chief is not going to be interested in getting a term extension, which frequently happens with army chiefs in Pakistan. So, at any rate, this current government, I think, would like to stay in power long enough, at least through November, where it'll have an opportunity to make the really important decision of who the next army chief will be. And again, as Sahar and I both emphasize, the military plays an outsized role in Pakistani politics, and the army chief is a very powerful political player. But the longer this government is in power, I think the more politically vulnerable it gets, and the more the advantage shifts to Khan looking ahead to the election. And that's because this government inherited a really serious economic crisis, which will likely get a lot worse before it gets better, especially if the impacts of the Ukraine war on the global economy, such as surging commodities prices, continue to be in place. And so, the longer this government is in power and the more it's clear it's unable to fix the economy, which it quite frankly would not be able to do within a period of months, that means that the public could get increasingly unhappy and restive and not willing to vote this government back to power. So that suggests to me that even if you set aside the issue that any political figure would just want to hold on to power as long as possible, it would arguably serve the political prospects of the parties that comprise this national unity government, whatever you want to call it, to have elections considerably earlier than next year. So that's why I think we should really keep our expectations low about what to get from this government. And indeed, there have been some major shifts announced by Shehbaz Sharif, the new prime minister, in his first few days in power, particularly in terms of his views on trying to strengthen relations with the U.S. And with the EU. He's proposed some changes in economic policies. But again, we're looking at a short-term government here. So I think that we need to keep that in mind when thinking about what the impacts of this new government could be on domestic affairs in Pakistan and more broadly externally as well.
Sahar, if this is a short-term government, do you think they will be doing major changes in the direction of Pakistan's foreign policy or economic policy, or frankly, this is a caretaker until the next election comes in?
I mean, ideally, it would be a caretaker till the next election comes in. I think that's something that should be done. But the thing about Pakistani politics is it's always hard to predict what's going to happen. So um, I don't really know. I mean, I'm hoping that Shehbaz Sharif, calls elections. I mean, there's been some discussion of whether he'll probably call early elections or, keep them as scheduled. But he should call elections. I think what will be interesting to see is that the Chief of Army Staff's extension, General Qamar Bajwa's Chief of Army Staff position was extended 3 years ago, and he's up for another extension in November. And I think one of the responsibilities, along with sort of the economic crisis, is whether or not the caretaker prime minister will extend the Chief of Army Staff position for another 3 years. And Shehbaz Sharif this is his first time as prime minister. He is Nawaz Sharif's brother, but and sort of he's been accused or labeled as the person who's been doing the stuff behind the scenes in Pakistan Muslim League. But all that aside, this is sort of Shehbaz Sharif's first stint as prime minister, no matter how short it is, and he generally has a good relationship with the military. He's not really one to antagonize the military. So it's really unclear. I think there are two main challenges that face Shehbaz Sharif right now. The number one challenge is Pakistan's economy. And even within that, I don't think there's anything that he can really do because, as Michael said, it's a short-term government ideally, and of course the changes that Pakistan needs economically are mainly structural, and those changes, take years to do. So I don't think we'll see any movement there. But the second challenge facing Shehbaz Sharif is civil-military relations and what's going to happen with the Chief of Army Staff position. And Shehbaz Sharif, just recently met with the president, Dr. Arif Alvi, for the first time, and there's been some positive discussion there. But I think a lot of it will depend on when elections actually take place.
So, Michael, how will this change the relationship between Islamabad and India? Frankly, if we see the Pakistanis go further towards the American side, are they likely to be more cooperative with New Delhi, or this is now a bit of a set of flux, and both sides will look to take advantage of the situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, I'm in India now, and I'm getting this question a lot. I think that we shouldn't really overstate the impact that this new government in Pakistan could have on India-Pakistan relations. Really, for the same reason that I already mentioned before, that there's not going to be enough time for there to be any type of major shift or any type of new policy or any type of transition or evolution in policy toward India, just because the government isn't going to be in power that long. I mean, it is significant that very soon after Shehbaz Sharif took office, Prime Minister Modi offered a very conciliatory message via Twitter, I believe. And Shehbaz Sharif himself issued a conciliatory message toward Modi, and that would be that's a change already, in the sense that there'd been a lot of sharp and nasty rhetoric accompanying the India-Pakistan relationship in recent years. Though it is notable that one of the curious things that Imran Khan did during his last days in power is he suddenly started praising India. I think the reason he was doing that is that he was basically making a point that India has an independent foreign policy, and it's not going to succumb to the pressure of the U.S. and the West about what it does in terms of its views on Russia. Imran Khan was trying to make the point that the opposition had been willing to be goaded by the U.S. into doing this opposition vote, and even India is better than that. So that was the type of narrative for that. At any rate, I think that India itself will see this government in Pakistan as a short-term one, and therefore not worth one investing a lot of time in and trying to explore interest in shifting to a different type of position, or whatever the case may be. And also, I think for political reasons in India, you have this nationalist, Hindu nationalist government in India, which I don't think, politically speaking, would find it particularly convenient at this time to extend an olive branch to Pakistan, even with the new prime minister in office. Final point, it's widely believed that it's really the military in Pakistan and not the civilian government that makes the final decisions on policies toward India. And so that suggests that whatever was going to happen, whether Imran Khan survived or not, the trajectory of the relationship with India from Islamabad's perspective, it would really depend on what the military wants to do, and not whoever the prime minister wants to do. Final point on this: I think things may not get better in a huge way, but I do think things will definitely not get worse, barring any type of unforeseen situation. And that's because about a year ago, more than a year ago, India and Pakistan signed a new border ceasefire, which brought an end to what had been rising levels of violence on the border in recent years. And that will certainly lower the temperature, just knowing that that border is quiet. India had a strong interest in signing that accord just because it wanted to be able to focus more fully on its border with China, which has become particularly hot in recent years. But the short of it is, I don't think we should expect any major transformations in the India-Pakistan relationship with this new government in place, but I'm cautiously optimistic that things shouldn't necessarily get any worse either.
Sahar, well, speaking of China there, do you think this will change Pakistan's relationship with China? We have seen over the Khan administration a lot more Chinese money being invested into Pakistan. Do you think now, without Khan in power, that they will go back to looking at the IMF as their primary source of bailouts and loans, and much less reliant on China going forward?
No, I think the reliance on China will continue. In fact, Shehbaz Sharif has even, I think, said at some point that he wants to speed up the Chinese-backed infrastructure projects in Pakistan, which are part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So Shehbaz Sharif is very interested in maintaining a good relationship with China and making sure that Chinese money continues to flow within Pakistan. But Pakistan will also probably look towards the IMF too, which I think indicates just how bad the economic situation is. And not only is, the IMF loan sort of an issue, but the main issue facing Pakistan, and like I'm not an economist, but just from my understanding of Pakistan's economy, one of the main things that the IMF has sort of pressured Pakistan to do is to increase their tax base. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Um, I mean, I think about 32% or 34% of Pakistan's tax revenues were generated by direct taxes. And that was in, I think, 2004, and about 2006 or 2007, that increased to 39%. But even then, that's just simply not enough. And what the country really needs is a way to tax its population. But this is something that the IMF and Pakistan both have sort of struggled with and gone back and forth on. So keeping that in mind, I think Shehbaz Sharif will continue having good relations with China and also continue to look towards the IMF. Another pressure facing Shehbaz Sharif is that Pakistan is still on the FATF gray list, which is the agency that sort of deals with anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing, and Pakistan was put on the gray list a few years ago. Pakistan is basically, I think, has met most of the recommendations, but there were like 39 recommendations, and Pakistan has completed about 37. So at least they're making some progress. But the Financial Action Task Force, which is the FATF, to remain on that gray list is also bad for the economy because it really discourages foreign direct investment. It really discourages, you know, other kinds of investments. And so I think Pakistan is trying to meet all the requirements and get off that gray list, especially because it might then help them with other, World Bank or IMF loans. But at the end of the day, Pakistan needs loans, which is a really troubling situation for the country. And I don't think Shehbaz Sharif, especially since it's such a short-term government, I don't think that there's anything he could potentially do to fix it. So his goal really would be, how do you sort of survive it for now till the elections, and then see what happens with the elections, whether or not he gets elected or not.
So a lot of great questions coming in our DMs, and this one's for Michael. We've seen right now ISIS-K being particularly active inside Afghanistan. We've seen attacks on Kabul. We've seen attacks in Uzbekistan. Is the particularly Pakistan soldiers have also been killed. Will the strategy for Afghanistan change under a Sharif government, and will there be a more frosty relationship between Kabul and Islamabad going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I get to it, very briefly, I just wanted to add to all of the challenges that Sahar has laid out for the new Pakistani government. The issue of terrorism is another one, and this relates to Afghanistan as well, in the sense that we've seen a resurgence in terrorist attacks over the last few years, mainly being perpetrated by the Pakistan Taliban, which is based in Afghanistan. And when the Taliban took over in August of last year, I think there was an expectation among Pakistani officials that the Taliban, which has this long-standing relationship with Pakistan, would be willing to work with Islamabad to try to curb this threat of Pakistan Taliban's presence in Afghanistan, but that has not happened. The Taliban is actually an ally of the Taliban in Afghanistan is an ally of the Taliban in Pakistan, and so the Afghan Taliban has been unwilling to do anything to curb the Pakistan Taliban, and that's helps lead to an even greater resurgence in attacks. So that's something that Shahbaz Sharif will be dealing with. So in terms of what this new government could mean for Pakistan's relationship with Afghanistan, I mean, certainly, as I think was mentioned before, it appears that Imran Khan had at least a small soft spot for the Taliban in the sense that he offered some very happy celebratory words when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan. And so, the Taliban would certainly remember that, and that may have an impact in terms of how it thinks about this next government. But you know what? To be quite frank, the Taliban is in a really desperate position right now. We talked about Pakistan's economic crisis. Afghanistan is in a dire economic state right now, and the Taliban regime there looks to Pakistan as really one of the key and only countries willing to sort of go out on a limb in global forums and on the international stage and call for the world to do more to bring more money into Afghanistan, even if that means putting money in the Taliban's hands, which most Western countries don't want to do. So, for the Taliban's perspective, its view of Pakistan is not going to change. It's going to continue to want to work with it to the extent that it can. But that said, there are also other factors at play here that have impacted the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan in the Taliban era that have nothing to do with who's in government in Pakistan. And one of those factors is the fact that the Taliban, since it took over, has been trying to assert its independence from Pakistan and is trying to prove to the Afghan people that it no longer needs to be reliant on Pakistan for sanctuaries because the war and the insurgency in Afghanistan is over. So it's been trying to assert its independence, and that has meant lashing out at Islamabad. It has meant senior Taliban representatives issuing withering criticism of Pakistan that you would not have heard in previous years. It has also entailed some very sharp opposition on the part of the Taliban to Pakistani efforts to provide fencing around the border, which the Taliban does not accept, much like other Afghan governments that have been in power since Pakistan became independent. So there are some tensions between Kabul and Islamabad, and I think that certainly the Sharif government will want to try to address them. But these factors sort of have a mind of their own, and they play out in ways that go beyond whoever may be in power in Pakistan. And given the last few days, when we've seen the Pakistani military launch airstrikes into Afghanistan, they claim to be going after Pakistani Taliban targets there, but according to multiple reports, those military operations have killed a number of civilians in Afghanistan, and that's going to make things even worse between the two. So it's a pretty messy relationship, one that's a lot messier than many in Pakistan had thought the relationship with Kabul would be after the Taliban takeover. And so it's going to be very difficult for Shahbaz Sharif and his government to work through that. But again, much like with the relationship with India, it's the army and the military that'll have, as well as the ISI, that'll have a key stake and a key role in figuring out how to deal with the situation in Afghanistan.
So I've only got about 5 minutes left of the panel, unfortunately. So I'm going to throw a couple of last questions. So Sahar, do you think this will change the relationship between Pakistan and the United States? We know that Biden did snub Imran Khan. Do you think he will actually get on the phone and call Sharif and even talk about putting new bases into Pakistan with the instability in Afghanistan on the rise?
So I don't think that I don't think President Biden is gonna call Shahbaz Sharif, but with the question that you have about the bases, Imran Khan was actually pretty straightforward about the base issue, which was that the Pakistan would never host a U.S. base, and if the U.S. wants to use Pakistan as a base, they can use Pakistani bases, to launch drone strikes, airstrikes, etc. And this is something which, by the way, Pakistan has allowed the U.S. to do. There was a thing called the Coalition Support Fund, which was sort of like a reimbursement program where the U.S. paid Pakistan or reimbursed them for using their bases to launch airstrikes in Afghanistan. And then, of course, there was the relationship that the U.S. had with Pakistan in terms of the foreign military financing, which is a grant program where basically the U.S. gives countries grants so that they can buy US weapons, and Pakistan was one of the recipients of these grants. So I think maybe those will reopen because the Trump administration had sort of shut both those programs down. Perhaps they might reopen. It's unclear. And the reason why I don't think that they probably won't open is because the US is no longer in Afghanistan anymore. So US interests in the region have changed. Not that significantly, but in terms of actually having troops on the ground, it's certainly changed US-Pakistan relations. So I don't think that Shehbaz Sharif hasn't really commented ever on the US having a base in Pakistan, but I think this would probably be something that him and Imran Khan agree on, which is that Pakistan should not have a US base. And also, you can't discount the army in this, right? The Pakistani army does not want an American military base in Pakistan. If that's something that they don't want, then that's not something that's going to happen. So I don't think the base issue is going to change at all. But whether Biden calls Shehbaz Sharif, I wouldn't hold your breath.
Michael, last question to bring us home. How do you think this will change Pakistan's trajectory over the next year or so? Do you think things are going to improve, or frankly, there's more chaos down the line for Pakistan going forward?
What I worry about the most is political instability. I mean, we did have a peaceful transfer of power in the sense that Imran Khan eventually did accept the fact that he had been ousted by the no confidence vote, and the process began to elect a new prime minister within the National Assembly, and there's a new government in place, and that's that. However, Imran Khan is clearly going to continue this narrative that the new government is a bunch of traitors that colluded with the U.S. to oust Imran Khan. Those are extremely dangerous and serious allegations to make, but that's become his rallying cry. One could describe it as a rallying lie if one like me thinks that the idea of a conspiracy against Khan to oust him was wrong. But that rhetoric's going to play out. Khan has the ability to mobilize. He's able to get a lot of people on the streets. So we're going to see a lot of pressure on this government. But the new government is not going to take well to that narrative. And that, I think, suggests the possibility for, an even more, as I said before, polarizing partisan environment at a time when this new government really needs to be focused on the economic crisis, which is the most serious issue. So I do fear that the economic crisis could get worse. The political environment could get increasingly volatile, and meanwhile, this threat of terrorism from the Pakistani Taliban as well as ISIS-K remains very much present. So I think the trajectory is certainly not good, and I think that we'll really have to see what happens when the elections happen. That'll be a key marker.
So I want to say absolutely huge thanks to everyone who tuned in for this Twitter space. I want to thank the people who sent questions through as well. We didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but I will see how many I can forward on to my staff and get my staff to see if they can answer your questions for you. I want to thank our panelists, Sahar and Michael. Both of you were absolutely fantastic to come on and chat about this and give us a quick briefing and a bit of a field update on what's going on. And if you want to check out and listen to this recording again, that'll be on YouTube in the next few days. So thank you so much, Sahar. Thank you so much, Michael. You're both absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure we'll have you back sometime soon.
Thank you so much, and great to see you too, Michael.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. Take care.
And have a good night, everybody.